Without further ado, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Jean-Luc Cartron, who managed the project and represents Daniel B. Stevens and Associates, and will be leading the presentation, getting us started. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sandra. On behalf of our entire team, I would like to thank you for attending this meeting and for your interest in the recently released draft Wildlife Corridors Action Plan. We've included a lot of analyses and information in the action plan. At the scale of the entire state, the action plan identifies and prioritizes wildlife vehicle collision hotspots and wildlife corridors, proposes concrete engineering solutions for reducing wildlife vehicle conflicts and enhancing habitat connectivity, and presents a detailed cost-benefit analysis of all proposed solutions. The scope and goals of the action plan required assembling a multidisciplinary team of road ecologists, wildlife biologists, transportation experts, modelers, GIS specialists, and engineers. They're all listed on this slide, but in addition to our team members, we also benefited from the assistance of a number of researchers, NGOs, government agencies, and tribes. These collaborators are all named at the beginning of the action plan, but we'd like to thank them all again here, as well as the New Mexico Department of Transportation, NMDOT, which funded the project starting in the fall of 2019 when Daniel B. Stevens and Associates was contracted out by NMDOT to develop the plan. So here's what we would like to cover with our presentation tonight. We'll go briefly over the history of road mitigation projects already implemented or in the process of being implemented in New Mexico. We'll present the Wildlife Corridors Act passed in early 2019, without which the action plan would not have been developed. We'll say a few words about the methodology we employed to arrive at the top 11 recommended project areas, that is the top 5 wildlife vehicle collision hotspots and the top 6 wildlife corridors. Next, we'll present each of those 11 priority areas, and we'll conclude with a few remarks on what are likely to be the next steps. As we go through the presentation, Dr. Patricia Kramer, our team's top expert in the field of road ecology, Mark Watson of the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish, Matt Heverland of NMDOT, and I will pass the baton to each other as we present the slides. So up first is Mark Watson for the history of mitigation projects. Mark.
Thank you, Jean-Luc. Good evening, everybody. My name is Mark Watson. I'm the terrestrial habitat specialist with New Mexico Department of Game and Fish. I'm the department lead for implementing the Wildlife Corridors Act. And I'm going to provide a real brief summary of the history of wildlife vehicle collision mitigation projects in New Mexico. And they're on the map that you see here in green stars, indicates where those projects are. And more details on these projects can actually be found in Appendix A of the draft action plan. So there's about 10 wildlife vehicle collision mitigation projects that have been completed in New Mexico. And these projects have been driven primarily by 3 legislative memorials and driver safety concerns. And up until the passage of the Wildlife Corridors Act, there was really not a clear process for how somebody would propose and implement a wildlife vehicle collision mitigation project. Next slide, please. So the first project that was built by New Mexico DOT was US 550 from Aztec to the Colorado border that had about the highest deer vehicle collision rate in the state. And there were 3 small round corrugated metal culverts that were enlarged to concrete box culverts, large concrete box culverts, and about 3 miles of 8-foot fence was installed to direct primarily mule deer, but other wildlife to these culverts. And all 3 of these culverts have been monitored and documented to have hundreds, if not thousands, of successful mule deer passages through them. Next slide. The flagship project in New Mexico that some of you folks may have heard of is the Tijeras Canyon Safe Passage Project, and that was completed in 2007. And one unique thing about that project was it was really motivated by a coalition, the Tijeras Canyon Safe Passage Coalition, that really sort of pushed for a wildlife vehicle collision mitigation project in Tijeras Canyon and was successful at getting both agencies to work together to implement that project. And that might actually be a good model for future projects, building coalitions around local groups that support these projects. And just as a side note, New Mexico Department of Game and Fish has a Pittman-Robertson Act through the Wildlife and Sport, Pittman-Robertson Grant through the Wildlife and Sport Fish Restoration Act to replace the non-functional animal detection system on New Mexico Highway 333 in Tijeras Canyon, where we have our at-grade crosswalk. And we're working closely with New Mexico Department of Transportation and MAT to replace that non-functional detection system. Next slide, please. So finally, and certainly not least, we have an ongoing project that New Mexico Department of Transportation is in the process of building on I-25 between Raton and the Colorado border, where DOT is installing the first wildlife dedicated arch culvert underpass. I think there's another picture associated with that. And it has a natural substrate bottom, and it's got a 12-foot height. And we basically helped DOT design this to try and help facilitate elk and mule deer to move through that arch culvert. And that project hopefully will be completed sometime this year, hopefully this summer or fall. And with that, I'll hand it over to Matt.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, so this entire effort that we're talking about today was initiated by the creation of the Wildlife Corridors Act. The Act, which is also known as Senate Bill 228, was signed into law in 2019 and directs NMDOT and Game and Fish to develop a Wildlife Corridors Action Plan. The plan identifies segments that pose a risk to wildlife movement and to the traveling public. And the Wildlife Corridors Act tasks identifying these issues by combining wildlife vehicle collision data with ecological data. The legislation, which is actually the first of its kind in the nation, is a paramount stepping stone in ensuring that populations of large animals can safely traverse their habitats in New Mexico. So the purpose of the Wildlife Corridors Action Plan is to identify wildlife linkages across the state for large mammals and species of concern, to identify highway segments where we can promote motorist safety and wildlife connectivity, and to encourage NMDOT and Game and Fish to use the best available science, collaborate with tribal governments, non-government organizations, federal land management agencies, private landowners, and the public to identify mitigation actions in areas of concern. Next slide, please. Now, there were 6 large mammal focal species that drove much of our analysis and prioritization. These 6 focal species are actually specified in the Wildlife Corridors Act, which defines large mammal as deer, elk, pronghorn, bighorn sheep, black bear, and mountain lion. Next slide, please. So even though approximately 1/3 of the state is public land, several of these projects are proposed in areas with a substantial amount of private land. The Wildlife Corridors Act makes it very clear that the provisions of the Act do not apply to private property owners unless they choose to participate. Participation by private landowners is highly encouraged, however, as it will maximize the effectiveness of several of the proposed projects. Benefits to private landowners could be derived from any numerous types of easements or just from the enjoyment of increased wildlife presence on their property. And with that, I'll pass it on to Patty.
Hi there, I'm Patricia Kramer. I led the team here, and I just want to say everyone put in an amazing effort. Thank you, everyone. And I wanted to dedicate this this entire act to all of our parents that we lost during the progress of our research. We've lost 4 parents or parents-in-laws through this, and so we soldiered on, and we miss them. And we're happy to be able to deliver this to you. So thanks for your patience. We will be going through all these tasks that were mandated in the Act and tell you a little bit about them and spend most of our time on number 7 there, the corridors list. So forward to the next slide. The first task is data gathering, and it took months to over a year. And we brought in lots of information from the DOT on the roads, game and fish on where wildlife were known to go. Tribal resources had, the departments had GPS locational data, as did academic researchers. And nonprofit organizations were also very helpful. So we brought that all together and we started mapping and modeling. On the right, you'll see a picture there. That's just a small inset of a map that we made of all the deer crashes that we know of on New Mexico DOT roads. Next slide, we're going to have Jean-Luc talk to you more about the species of concern.
Thank you, Patty. Matt already mentioned the 6 large mammals identified in the Wildlife Corridors Act. The Act also mentions the need to develop a more complete list of species of concern, and that's one of the early steps we went through in collaboration with the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish. To generate that list of species of concern, we used 3 main criteria. And so our species of concern include, first, those species that pose a particular risk to the traveling public in New Mexico. Secondly, species that experience mortality from collisions with road traffic to the degree that it reduces or potentially reduces population levels or population densities of that species in the state. And or 3, species that avoid roads to the extent that roads represent important habitat connectivity barriers, even if there's not a lot of mortality recorded. Our list of species of concern was developed with input from expert mammalogists and herpetologists in New Mexico and based on a thorough review of the scientific literature. One word about the distribution maps. In the action plan, there's a distribution map for each species of concern, and we relied on them to tell us whether any given species may be present in a potential priority area and thus could benefit from the installation of an overpass, underpass, or both. That told us that the priority area under consideration is that much more important, and as a result, it received additional points in the scoring system. Some of the distribution maps that you will see in the action plan, those on carnivores, are based on the Wild Carnivores of New Mexico, a book that Dr. Jennifer Fry of NMSU and I are editing, and which should be published in the spring of 2023 by UNM Press. The book also includes future climate projections and associated shifts in the distribution of main ecosystem boundaries by the end of the century. This is all based on collaboration with Dr. Dave Gutzler and Dr. Jack Tripka. The main message of the results of all the analyses are that in the future, the problem of wildlife vehicle conflicts will likely go up rather than down, at least in the foreseeable future, if we don't do anything. Patty, back to you.
All right, thank you, Jean-Luc. We did 2 kinds of approaches to find out where the most important areas are for wildlife to get across roads in New Mexico. On the left, it'll show you the hotspot modeling approach, and on the right is the habitat linkage modeling approach. Next slide. With the hotspot modeling, we used an ArcGIS tool called Optimized Hotspot Analysis using the Get a Sword statistic. It showed us where the density was greatest for crashes per mile per year. And we started with 10 hotspots with that and formulated a little bit more we'll tell you about. On the right, our team modeled habitat linkages, which are vast areas where animals need to move between mountain ranges and across the state to move around, basically, and where those places intersected roads. Next slide. That program that was used was called Unicorn, and it modeled single species of those 6 focal species, and then it combined them. And as we go ahead, Jean-Luc will tell you more about that habitat modeling. Or do I? Nope. Nope, Scott, I apologize. All right, so with the hotspots, we had 10 hotspots and we had to bring them down to 5. We brought in other factors that related to transportation, wildlife, and the feasibility on whose land it was, and came up with a scoring system that was very quantitative and transparent to come up with the top 5 hotspots. The wildlife corridors, we brought that linkage modeling together along with real solid data from GPS collars, and also you see that SO 3362 is from Interior Secretarial Order 3362 that dictated to states to, hey, take a look and decide where your top wildlife migration corridors are. And of course, the Interior Secretary helped give money to promote those and study those animals. We also had information from animals on tribal land, carcass and crash data on tribal land that were very helpful. And our nonprofit partners also gave us input to help us select the top wildlife corridors. Next. And
Thanks, Patty.
We're going to modeling and Jean-Luc will tell us.
Well, very briefly, I'll use the example of the cougar to explain just a little bit more about the modeling of wildlife corridors. On the left-hand side is a habitat suitability map generated for the species, emphasizing topographic relief and tall, dense vegetation as some of the most important landscape attributes defining highly suitable habitat for the species. On the right-hand side is a resistance layer map showing where resistance is higher or lower to cougars in their movements around the landscape. The next step from the resistance layer is to populate a virtual pixelated landscape with virtual animals and allow them to move around using that resistance layer map. And in the end, you arrive at the map in the middle, which shows corridors intersecting roads. Back to you, Patty.
All right, on task number 3, our fabulous field crews went out to look at these places that wound up being the top 5, well, actually the top 6 corridors, and also we went out to the top 10 wildlife vehicle crash sites to find the top 5 of those. So again, we use an ArcGIS tool called Survey 123. It's something that we put an app on your phone, and the crews went out to all these hotspots and corridors and looked at all the structures that were there to see how they could be either upgraded to something better for wildlife or retrofit with existing fence, or we could build new wildlife crossing structures. And then they marked every single one of those sites, as you see on the map in the center. I just tallied this evening the top 11 projects that we put forth. They looked at 377 locations across the state. So the project went from a very big statewide analysis down to the very nitty-gritty look at specific culverts and bridges and locations. On those pictures on the left, you can see some of the places they mentioned where we should do something, and where the road was below the topography, there was a cut. Those are the best places for overpasses, whereas the underpasses are where the road is either even with the topography or actually above the landscape. So the team members are myself and Jeff Gagnon from Arizona Game and Fish and his team. We know wildlife crossings very well and what will work for elk and mule deer, bighorn, and every species has their preferences, which we'll tell you more about in the particular projects. Next. We did a benefit cost, but it did not figure into any prioritization. It was just to show you once we chose these sites, how long it would take for these places to pay for themselves. The benefits are in the numerator, and it includes how you would reduce the number of crashes that are happening with wildlife and what that value would be, divided by the denominator or the cost of the mitigation. Next. We developed the action plan, which I'll tell you more about on task 7. Next. Okay, public involvement was very important, and it actually is one of the things that makes our wildlife corridors action plan unique compared to some of the other states that are working on it. We took your public comments from 2020 at the very beginning to see what was important, and it really did help influence what we chose. Notices were sent out to people. We had 8 public meetings in February and March of 2020. 5 did occur before COVID-19 restrictions shut down public meetings. You can see there they were in Raton, Albuquerque, Santa Fe, Farmington, and Las Cruces. Websites, the website still exists. You'll see it at the end of the slide, shown an email where you can contact Matt Haverland to tell him more about what you think. In 2021, we reached out to the tribes again to ask for input, and we were very much rewarded. And we released a 2020 annual report via the website. Next. What we can kind of overview of what people said in the comments, we had 84 individuals that participated in those meetings, and we had 30 comments that I went through multiple times to try and help give points to different places that we were looking at to see what was important. And so people generally gave support for the plan, gave us locations they thought we should focus on, and gave us particulars that they thought we should be paying attention to and bringing in, which we did. Next. Now for 2022, we've got the draft action plan has been released and is available on our website that you probably went to sign up for the Zoom meeting. We have tonight's virtual meeting and another one on Thursday, and we will take your comments till March 12th. Then after that, we'll work for a couple of months to finalize the plan, and then you'll be ready to go. I wanted to make sure you understood that all this information was brought together to help us select the wildlife corridors and the hotspots. So we did, as I said, we brought in data from the tribes where they had a lot of GPS collared animals on tribal land, researchers' data on animals they had collared, nonprofit organizations had cameras out, and documents and public support, and that all was brought together to help us decide what was important to you in New Mexico. Next. So those corridors and hotspots are based on the potential to reduce wildlife vehicle collisions, help protect areas that animals need to move across the landscape, a bit about on benefit costs that will definitely come into play in later years when we decide how we're going to pay for these, and then the support that we have from the community and the local landowners. Next. So here we'll go through every single project and let you know what we found. Next. So for wildlife corridors hotspots, these are areas where the crash data and all the information came together. The number 1 crash hotspot is in Cuba. The number 2 is in Silver City. The number 3 is in Ruidoso in the Sacramento Mountains. The number 4 is Glorieta Pass outside of Santa Fe on I-25. And the 5th one is Bent out in the Sacramento Mountains on US 70. Next. The top corridors, the number 1 corridor we have is in the Chama area in northern New Mexico. Number 2 is on the Del Norte, the Rio Grande del Norte National Monument in northern New Mexico. Number 3 is south of Raton in an area we call the Pronghorn Triangle. Number 4 is in the Peloncillo Mountains in the south where I-10 comes across. Number 5 is going to be the Sandia Jemez Mountains connection across I-25 north of Albuquerque. And number 6 is the Cuesta to Red River area in the northern mountains there. So with the next slide, we'll jump right in and tell you more about what we decided we would recommend for all these places. All right, the number 1 wildlife vehicle collision hotspot is Cuba. It's a 17-mile hotspot you can see in this map here. It goes across a lot of public land, in the purple in particular are BLM lands, but it's also important that the Jicarilla Apache Nation has some places on the northern end of the hotspot. So all the data showed that there was mostly elk, 120 elk crashes in 5 years, and 80 mule deer crashes, that they have to get across the road. And elk are very picky. They don't go under the road very much. You might get a bull elk to go underneath the culvert, but to get an entire herd, you need overpasses typically. Not always, but if you want to assure something's going to work out well, you try to recommend overpasses. So those blue semicircles you see, we've got 3 overpasses recommended. We tried to get them all on public land, 4 underpasses, and then 2 retrofits, which were where you bring a fence to an existing structure. So we hope that might actually start to happen in the coming years, but of course remains to be seen. Next one. Silver City is a bit tricky. If you look at this, this is a land ownership map. Most of the land there is private, so it's going to be real hard to try and place something with something kept in perpetuity. So we need to work with the landowners there. There's lots of retrofit in Silver City. There's about 7 structures where we say just put fence to the existing culverts and bridges to try and get the local deer that are accustomed to walking around Silver City to move beneath the road. Then on the edges, you have a couple of, we have 2 overpasses recommended for where the elk are and 9 more underpass structures that would be new to be built. So very interesting way to try and help Silver City reduce those crashes, which are 1.8 crashes per mile per year. Next, we have Ruidoso. Ruidoso is another tricky spot with a lot of private land. It's roads through the mountains there in the Sacramento Mountains. Again, we have to work very closely with private landowners and even the Mescalero Apache. We've got some structures suggested for them. We have 3 structures that we want to retrofit, which again are those red emblems you might see in there, the icons. We suggested 8 underpasses, either bridges or culverts, and 2 overpasses, again, at the outskirts of town where the elk are. So that's a little tricky. That's 34 miles of a hotspot that we'd have to work pretty intently with the local people to see what we can fix. Next, we have Glorieta Pass. Okay, the hotspot's only 3 miles, but we went ahead and we looked at 7 miles of potential retrofits and a new overpass. You can't quite see very well, but it's below the R and the I in Glorieta. There's a place where we would work to put an overpass. Black bear in this area quite a bit, and again, work with private landowners. Next. And then the Bent hotspot, when you just look at crashes per mile per year, it was the most intense one. And it's almost all elk. It's 1.8 crashes per mile per year. But we factored in other information and it dropped to 5. But we recommended to retrofit one of the bridges there, put in 7 underpasses and 1 overpass throughout that area. And some of those places go over to the Mescalero Apaches tribal lands as well. Next, we have Chama. Chama was 38 miles of a corridor. And we have, we looked at 66 different places there. We recommend 2 retrofits where we put fences to bridges, 7 new underpass structures, 10 underpass structures and 7 overpasses. Now they might not all get built, but we located exactly where the elk were moving across the road, where we have some protected wildlife management lands, where Hickory Apache is willing to put overpasses on their land as well. So again, we're going to work a lot with private landowners on this very long wildlife corridor where the mule deer and the elk move across in different seasons. And next, we have Del Norte, or the Rio Grande del Norte National Monument Wildlife Corridor. This one is very highly on public lands. And what we've got here is 25 miles of road. We've got no real opportunities for retrofits, so we recommended 5 new structures, which you'll see in green there. And then we've got 3 different overpass, or it looks like 3 or 4 different overpass locations where not only the picky or the elk, but the pronghorn as well are a little hesitant to go underneath. So we hope to see some wildlife crossing opportunities for the elk, mule deer, and the pronghorn in this important area. Next, we have the Pronghorn Triangle, which is just south of Raton. Pronghorn are very skittish. They don't even try to jump fences normally. And it's very difficult to get a herd of pronghorn to do anything but go over and overpass. So we looked at some overpass locations on I-25. Again, we've got private land up through here, a lot of big ranches that we might be able to work with, and then some other solutions with retrofitting with fence to existing structures. So the crew went out amazingly, looked at 69 miles of roads in this triangle and looked for solutions. So that's another area that we hope we can get something happening with our private landowner partners. Next, we have the Peloncillo Mountains in the southwest corner. Bighorn sheep live here, desert bighorn. Arizona Game and Fish have collars on bighorn that are on the north side of the road, and New Mexico Game and Fish have collars on Bighorn on the south side, and neither herd have they documented any of the animals crossing I-10. So this is a real bottleneck, not just for desert bighorn, but for carnivores coming and going between Arizona and New Mexico and even Mexico itself. And so we would hope to get some overpasses in there for the bighorn, who again are very skittish about going under roads, and also for these other animals. And finally, we have Sandia James Wildlife Corridor. This is, we're going to be looking at both Interstate 25 and US 550, 36 miles of roads here. We recommended 8 retrofits of existing structures on I-550, 5 new structures, and 5 overpasses. I can't say enough about the amazing work that's been done on the Pueblo of the Santa Ana with the collaring that their biologists have done of 5 species that you see here. They collared, put GPS collars on these animals, and we could see exactly where the animals from that tribal land tried to move about, and we were able to pinpoint places that animals need to move between these 2 mountain ranges. And also the crest of Montezuma is another wildlife corridor people have been working on for years, and that factored into the selection of this as well. And finally, we have the Cuesta corridor on New Mexico 38 in northern New Mexico. This is the #1 place for bighorn sheep. Again, we tried to get corridors and hotspots that on all 6 of our focal species, and we're looking to put possibly up to 3 overpasses there and an underpass or 2. But again, these are the animals that need overpasses. So next, those are our 11 projects that we recommend. And here is New Mexico's 11 hotspots and wildlife corridors for your action plan. Thank you. Next to, I think, Matt.
Yes, thank you, Patty. And excellent job summarizing a ton of information. So we are currently accepting comments through March 12th. Once we've gone through all the comments, we'll update the plan accordingly and release the final version this spring. We've already started exploring avenues for funding, and we'll continue to do such. This is one of our biggest challenges, but the opportunities will present themselves over time. We'll also be continuously monitoring the success of any implemented mitigation projects and can reassess and update our priority project lists on an annual basis or just as needed. Next slide, please. Here is some contact information in case you'd like to submit any comments or questions by email, phone, or just in a written form. All this contact information can also be found on the website listed here. Additionally, this presentation, the action plan, and other pertinent information can also be found on the website. And with that, we'll open the floor to any questions or comments.